This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 106 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week, with the help of special guest Mark Niemann-Ross, we discuss Ted Chiang's 1998 novella, Story of Your Life. We'd like to welcome our guest this week, the author of numerous sci-fi stories that have appeared in Analog magazine over the years, Mark Niemann-Ross. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks, Luke. This is great. I'm really glad to be here.
Thanks for coming on, Mark. I'm really excited. I heard that you guys went to a sort of presentation recently.
Yeah, it was the Science Fiction Writers Association annual reading, and Ted was actually there. It was really cool to hear him speak in person.
Yeah, it was awesome. I was there. So, Mark, you help organize these events in Portland?
Yeah, so I handle the logistics, making
Okay.
sure that there's a space to meet and that people actually show up and that there's things like microphones and electricity. So
Right. So my understanding is this is a quarterly event in and around Portland that they do. And there's also a similar event up in Seattle, right?
yeah, so what we do is we coordinate with the Seattle/Kirkland event. We get authors that will show up on a Tuesday, and they'll do 3 authors. They do a quick reading, about 20 minutes apiece. They get a day off, and then they come down here to Portland, and they do the exact same thing. So we coordinate with Seattle. It's the same authors, and it runs roughly every quarter with space in between for the summer break.
Yeah, cool.
You can hear more information about that at the sfwa.org website. Look under Readers, Resources, and you'll see the reading series right there.
That's so cool. And what an incredible story to see a presentation like that on. Like, there's so much to dig into, and so it's such a deep well to pull from. I feel like there's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
And it was interesting. Ted, his presentation didn't necessarily have a he wasn't directly talking about this story, but indirectly, as you read the story and you look at his presentation, Ted's all about the same theme coming up in a lot of different ways. It was really fascinating to see how he
Right.
connected the dots.
Absolutely, yeah. I want to get into more of that. But yeah, just to cap off the SFWA stuff, I've been to a few of them. They're a lot of fun. If you are in the Pacific Northwest, definitely check them out. There's all kinds of different writers that you'll get introduced to new ones, maybe some you know. Really cool event. While I was there, I was able to get a book, or actually I got 2 books signed by Ted. One was for me, but one I got for our podcast listeners. So I actually have a copy of Stories of Your Life and Others, signed by Ted Chiang, that I'm going to be giving out to our listeners. And the way to enter to win that, it's only 1 copy, but if you are listening to this episode, you're already doing the thing you need to do. All you got to do is send us an email with the subject line heptapods. Subject line heptapods. Let us know you want to enter to win the book, and you will be put on a list, and then we will be picking somebody at the. We decided we're going to do 1 week after our Arrival film episode, which is going to be next week. So it'll be about a 3-week giveaway process. Send that email in and enter to win. It's a cool collection, and yeah, you could have yourself a signed copy.
Yeah, is that Stories of Your Life?
Yes, Stories of Your Life
Yeah.
and Others.
Yeah, there's actually one story in there that was never published before. It's only in that collection.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I haven't got a chance
Yeah.
to read the whole thing. I just read this story, but as I was reading, I was like, I got to read this whole collection. It's great.
How many do you think are in there?
There are 7 stories here, and slash like novellas and stuff like that. Some of them are long stories, like Story of Your Life is pretty long. So yeah, 7.
Cool. Yeah, enter to win that book. I did want to reiterate that it's chosen randomly. We're not just picking someone. It'll be randomly determined.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll put your name on a list and do some sort of random number generator, and that'll be how it's determined. All right, so one other thing we want to do before we really get into it is we want to go ahead and thank our patrons, Cora S and Amanda VP. They spent their tokens that we awarded during our 100th episode spectacular celebration giveaway we were doing. They got tokens they could use to request a project. They put them towards this project, which unlocked, and now we're doing it. So you can thank them if you like these episodes.
And thank you to them for being patrons and putting their tokens towards this, because this was one we were going to do eventually, but I love that it's just been kicked up to priority and we're covering it now.
Right, it went to the top of the queue as soon as they paid it off, so it was like, oh, we're doing it now. And if you'd like to find out how you can also commission a project of your own choosing, go to patreon.com/inkToFilm. All right, so this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about Ted Chiang's bio, who he is, and some of this history of this story. Then we're going to talk about it in non-spoiler terms, if you're someone who's just checking out this episode, trying to decide if you want to read it. And then we will move into spoilers, but we'll definitely make sure to let you know so you can decide if you want to hear the spoilers or not. How's that sound, everybody?
Good.
Sounds cool.
Perfect. So before we get into this, I was thinking about it, Mark, and I think we rode up to a writer's retreat in March of, what, 2 years? No, almost 2 years ago now?
It was 2 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember we were talking about the podcast, and I think this project in particular came up, and we started to talk about it, and then I remember saying something like, no, don't talk to me about it, because I think I want to have you on the podcast, so you have to save it for then. So this is a conversation that has been waiting 2 years to happen, and in fact, I feel like several times we've almost had it, but I kept telling you, no, we gotta wait.
It's been aging and fermenting.
It's a little bit of commentary on this project, actually, right? It's like kind of like maybe you had that conversation then, and it's some sort of like time is a flat circle thing going on.
That's what I should have said, man. When we went to have it, I should say, I remember when we had this. I remember when we will have this conversation on the podcast.
I was just going to say, yeah, you have to mix tenses in order to appropriately talk about this story. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. We will have to discuss at some point about when we have this conversation. Let's see.
I remember when we will discuss Arrival next week.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
So if you haven't read the story, you probably don't know what that is. Essentially, one of the things I think is awesome about the story is the way Ted uses his tenses, and he talks about remembering events that have yet to occur. And when it's a fun little way to structure these flash forward, I guess, sections that intersperse our main plot line, which is the interacting with the aliens.
It's something that'll drive every English teacher crazy, because in a sentence he will mix tenses, and the first time I read this through, it was like, I'm not supposed to be doing, as a writer, I'm not supposed to do that, right? And then you look at it and go like, okay, he gets away with it. It's perfect what he did.
Yeah, he's deliberately doing it for a desired effect, right? To create that sense of being unstuck in time, which is my Vonnegut nod, which I think he'd approve of, because there's a quote he put in his story notes about Vonnegut, which I can get to in a minute here. But I want to let James weigh in. What do you think?
You were talking about his grasp of language and his grasp of like linguistics and the way he manipulates things, and I was just so blown away in the story by his like clearly passion for language and like the way he manipulates it and the way that he is kind of using language, and we'll get more into like the symbols and everything like that, but he's using language to mirror the plot and mirror some of the structure of the story. I was really blown away, and anytime I read a story where there's like a kind of satellite subject going on, because this is clearly a story about like language in a way, but I learned so much about language in reading this story. So many concepts I wasn't familiar with, and I always find that to be really engaging, to have like a second kind of thing to pull you in.
I read somewhere that it took him 5 years to figure out how to do this story, that he had to study linguistics for 5 years before he understood, how to make it work. That's a lot of time to research.
Yeah, sure is. So that kind of leads me. I'm going to use that to segue into a topic I wanted to address right at the top here. I've heard Ted being described as a hard science fiction writer, and that's a term that gets tossed around in our circles, our writing circles. And I found that in talking to people, a lot of people have different ideas about like what exactly that means. And as someone who has published a bunch of quote-unquote hard sci-fi stories in analog, I thought I'd see what your thoughts are on that as a genre, what defines it, if possible, and and what do you think of the public conception of it?
Yeah. So I classify myself as a hard science fiction writer. And what for me that means is that I have to stay, my stories have to stay within generally acceptable bounds of physics. And every once in a while I get, like one gimme, one thing. But if I do that, then everything else has to fall into place behind that. So, if you're going to do faster than light travel, then you have to still pay attention to the laws of, relativity, physics, and that kind of stuff as we currently know it. Or thermodynamics. If you're going to do faster than light travel, thermodynamics still applies. And you have to understand those laws. You can't just suddenly turn off thermodynamics and expect, things to work. When I read what Ted has done here, there is a lot of stuff that he left untouched, unspoken, unexplained, and that leaves him within the range of hard science fiction because he doesn't have to explain necessarily that bit.
Right. So in particular, I saw that when he was discussing the Fermat's principle of least time in this story, he says that he kind of left out some of the like nitty-gritty stuff of the like subatomic level. I'm forgetting the names of these like right. concepts, but there's some more science to this that he omitted, and he went with the more like classical look, a conceptual look at this principle. And I don't know. Yeah, like you said, like I think because he chose not to go into it, he's giving himself a little bit of wiggle room there.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, he's operating within the bounds of a novella. He's only got so much time to explain relativity or, variance and the calculus of variance. And, right. Oh, my God, it's like, get on with the story. So,
Right. Well, so that I think, what, actually, before we get into sort of our general thoughts on this, I do want to talk for a moment about his biography, a little bit I could find on him, because I do think it is interesting to give context to what we are reading here. So Ted Chiang was born in Port Jefferson, New York, to parents who immigrated to America from Taiwan after first fleeing China during the Chinese Communist Revolution. So he then later graduated from Brown University with a computer science degree, and then later attended Clarion's writer workshop in 1989. So he's a Clarion graduate, which is cool because I know a bunch of those these days, and so it's always fun to hear that. I'm sure they are proud of him.
Yeah.
So he has won 4 Nebula Awards, 4 Hugo Awards, the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer, which has been renamed, and 4 Locus Awards. So this is a guy who is highly decorated, highly respected in our field, and honestly, a very popular writer right now, as evidenced by I think he had a really good turnout at that reading presentation he did. So the story of your life first appeared in a collection called Starlight 2, which was published by Tor Books. In the story notes for his collection that I have here, he wrote that the inspiration for Story of Your Life came from a fascination in the variational principle in physics. And I wanted to see if you can give us a quick rundown of what that means, Mark, because I was trying to read it about what that means, and I was struggling. It seems to have something to do with this. It's talked about in the story a little bit, like the minimum, maximum kind of values of things, and how you can either go to a minimum or a maximum.
Yeah. So talk about putting me on the spot.
Man. Yeah, I really am. Yeah. It's okay if not. I mean, I honestly, I didn't get it, but I was like, maybe this is something everybody else understands, and I just don't. I don't know.
Oh, Lord. I looked this up, and I read through it. I'm getting deep into statistics right now. I teach a programming language for that. And so to wrap my head around calculus, it's like I only got so many brain cells in a day's, I can only expend so many. Variational calculus, which is what he's playing with here, is beyond me, and I would only give you a Manser. about what that happens to be.
A mancer?
A mancer, a man answer. It's like,
Okay.
right?
Right.
I don't know, I'll make something up. Sounds good. So.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, so I won't make you do that. But
Good.
Suffice it to say, this is I think why it's called hard science fiction, right? Like it's dealing with real stuff that is cutting edge in a lot of ways, or it seems like it to me. It's really a beautiful example of what hard science fiction can be. And we can talk about this in a second, but everything that you look at that Ted has done, he has done the research to, and you could probably use it as an example in some calculus course as to how this stuff works, or linguistics. Right. Well, okay, so one last thing I'm going to say here about the story before we get into it is that he has said that Kurt Vonnegut summed it up best in his introduction to the 25th anniversary edition of his novel Slaughterhouse-Five. So I was thinking about Slaughterhouse-Five a lot while reading this story, actually. So I thought it was fun to see that sort of nod to Kurt Vonnegut that he put in here. Here's the quote that he has.
Goodbye. Hello.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
This is Kurt Vonnegut giving a quote about Slaughterhouse-Five, but Chang has said that it applies to his story as well. So, Stephen Hawking found it tantalizing that we could not remember the future, but remembering the future is child's play for me now. I know what will become of my helpless, trusting babies because they are grown-ups now. I know how my closest friends will end up because so many of them are retired or dead now. To Stephen Hawking and all others younger than myself, I say, be patient. Your future will come to you and lie down at your feet like a dog who knows and likes you no matter what you are. So I thought that was a lovely quote. I'm a huge fan of Kurt Vonnegut, so that made me happy to see. And it does really apply to this story, too. So, yeah, what do you think of that, Mark?
Kurt was one of the first authors I got into, and wrapping your head around that one after I grew up reading E. Doc Cummings, The Lensman, which was all about big spaceships flying around really fast and ray guns and stuff. And then I get a hold of this Slaughterhouse-Five thing. It was like, what is this? This is not what I used to know about science fiction. So it's really delightful
not a hard
to see.
sci-fi writer. You could safe to say about Kurt Vonnegut.
Oh no, well he's a something else. But it's a really interesting thing that Ted was inspired by that particular story, and it fits in. It makes a lot of sense.
Right. At some point, I hope we'll get to cover that, James. I think there is a adaptation out there that I don't think is very well respected, although I might be confusing that with Breakfast of Champions. I don't know, but either way, I hope we get to talk about that novel at some point because I absolutely love it.
Yeah, a good friend of mine has said that he's told me multiple times to read it, and it's, since we started the podcast, I'm like, I think there is an adaptation, and I still haven't read Slaughterhouse-Five, and I really would love to.
Yeah. If they haven't made an adaptation, they need to so that we can cover it.
Yeah, seriously.
So yeah, just to dig in a little bit to that quote, I think it's also interesting, like this idea that when you're older, you essentially have seen your future play out before you. And the relationship to that future, the idea that it will come and lie down at your feet like a dog who knows and likes you no matter what you are, is where I think this quote really gets surprising to me. There's a sort of acceptance of your own present, I guess, that I read into that, which does feel applicable to this story in general terms.
This story made me think a lot about kind of the idea, because we're dealing with sort of traveling through time, or dealing with like time in a nonlinear sense. It made me think a lot about like determinism and what it means to if you believe that everything is fated to happen, or everything will happen a certain way, whether you push it in the opposite direction or not, or whether it's this idea of free will. If you knew what your future holds, could you change it, or would you change it? And would you just end up in the same place anyway? And I don't know. This story has a lot of that wrapped up in it, more than I remembered there being in the film.
Now we're getting into the film, but the one of the beauties about this story is that he does cover exactly that, what you're saying. The idea of free will, and if you knew what you were going to do, would you go ahead and do it anyhow? And we approach the idea of free will and determinism as something that we should defeat or try to try to circumvent. And Ted mentioned this in his lecture. He talks about, Oedipus.
Right. Yeah.
Like Oedipus tried to get outside of the bounds of his prophecy and fell into it anyhow. We don't talk much about the idea that if you did know your fate, maybe it's something that you would want to cooperate with, rather than, getting in there and trying to mess with the gears of time.
Yeah, that's a endlessly fascinating topic to me, and you're right. This is what his presentation he did was on, in a nuts and bolts sense. I felt like he opened up talking about prophecy as being a sort of backwards time travel for information, information traveling to you in the past from the future. And so he was talking about all this, the history of time travel stories in our culture. And then he talked about the difference between, time travel stories that are sort of about a determinist worldview where you can't escape your future. And then how in modern times he's noticed that a lot of modern sci-fi time travel stories are all about changing your future. And that's because our society has embraced free will as like something that we all want and want to believe we have. And those are stories that are sort of champion the idea of free will. And it is fascinating to coda to this, to read this story after that presentation and to see that this is something that is so intrinsic to this story and in the idea of this main character, Luis. And I guess it's a bit of a spoiler, so maybe I'll save some of this for later. But for now, I'll just say that she is dealing with these questions and how she wants to handle the new view of time that she acquires throughout the course of the story. Trying not to spoil anything. But yeah, so in broad terms, what do you think of that?
Ooh, without giving away the story, I mean, it's and we can talk more about the structure of the story and how he flips back and forth between two. It's two interlaced stories.
Yeah.
One of them being a very, very much like an info dump on all of this language stuff that he's learned, right. And another one on how one of his characters deals with the change that makes in her particular life. And thank God he jumps back and forth, because otherwise it would be a pretty dry read, or a pretty emotional read. Yeah.
So that does springboard me into wanting to talk about. So people might be checking out this episode of the podcast to determine whether or not they want to read this story. Maybe they saw the movie, fan of the movie, curious about the story. So when someone asked me about this just recently, I wholeheartedly recommended to them with the caveat of there's a lot of science in there, and you may find the science sort of dry at times. But if this sort of stuff fascinates you, then I don't think that'll be a problem at all. And so that's sort of where I land on that. What about you two? Who do you think should read this story, or how do you feel about that?
I think if you're interested in like non-traditional sci-fi stories, something that's hard to, not hard, but it might take a couple rereads of a couple sections to really wrap your head around some of these concepts. I think it's a really engaging read. I think, like I said before, I think there's a lot there. There's the linguistic side of it. There's the time, nonlinear time, kind of like what that represents. And then, I mean, you also have aliens. So if you're interested in something like that, you're dealing with aliens in the kind of not a traditional, I guess more film sci-fi, not a traditional way. There's tons of novels that are in keeping with this sort of like more serious and analytical tone of a sci-fi story. You know what I mean? Just like more of like a typical sci-fi film that you would see would be more of. Yeah.
I think that is still non-traditional, because I would say the majority of sci-fi does deal with it in a similar way that films do, in my experience. Maybe I'm wrong in that. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I see the movie and the story as being just a pair, and you really ought to look at them both. I mean, I'm really impressed with how the filmmakers took this thing. We'll talk more about this, but the story itself. Yeah, next week. Cover it next week. The story itself, what I really appreciate is that there is there is enough science that I can go as deep as I want. And, my calculus buddies and the physicist buddies are going to have a heyday going through this thing and argue for days about one paragraph. But you know what? If you don't want to go that deep, that's okay, because there's a lot of narration that kind of gives you context from a realistic humanistic point on what this stuff is changing. How does it make a difference? And you can get a vague idea of what he's talking about by breezing through the scientific components of the story. I mean, you shouldn't be put off by the science in the story. You shouldn't be as scared of it. Dive in, get as deep as you want. And it'll, whatever you pick up will be useful for understanding the rest of this collection.
I agree, and so that's kind of where I came in on it at, is that the science is really interesting. I am not someone who has much of a scientific background, other than some courses I took here and there in college, even though I was a English major. So I have the English major's understanding of most science, which is to say not great. But I love to learn about it, and I love to do my own independent research on it, watch videos, that kind of stuff. And one of the things I loved about Ted's presentation is how accessible it was for someone like me who doesn't have that background. I don't have a degree in physics or that kind of thing. And I think that's the same thing with this story. You don't have to have a degree in this kind of stuff. You don't have to be a linguistics expert to read this story and appreciate it. But you're right, there's a lot of depth to where if you are a linguistics expert, I suspect you'll read this and get a lot out of it and maybe find a way to engage with it on that level. And then, of course, one of the things that I think makes Ted's writing special, in just this small amount I've gotten into, is that the emotional truth behind those sections about Luis's daughter throughout is really powerful. And it's the kind of thing you normally only see in really accomplished sort of literary writers. And to see the combination of those scenes that were just like emotionally poignant, and then you pair it with the deep science, it was really cleverly done, expertly done, and something that I definitely admired when I read the story. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, you should check it out.
I like what you said about like the merging of those two things. Like I was noticing a lot of patterns with that. Like I was noticing this merging of like an analytical perspective with the emotional, more abstract things that were going on with our main character and the way that she was perceiving the world. And then you can just go down the story piece by piece and see these like comparisons or like, I don't know, merging or just completely juxtapositions. But you see like the aliens and us, and you see the way that their language represents kind of their culture, and you see our language as maybe more analytical or more concrete with like the alphabet, and like we have very specific symbols, and theirs is more interpretive, and then we have like the difference of our main character, the protagonist, and her husband, and kind of their sort of like math versus language background, and I just kept seeing this pattern. And I thought that was really effective, and it kind of, he was able to tell two very different structures or subjects within that narrative to kind of get at the analytical side of people and the emotional side of people.
Yeah, he's very efficient with his characters, and by that I mean that he uses, like Louise, the main voice in the character, represents that linguistic thing, and she's our proxy into this whole world, this whole understanding, and she does a really good job of explaining what it is that she is learning as she's learning it. Now she does that by explaining it to now I spaced out his name,
Gary, I think.
Gary, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so she does it by explaining it to Gary, aka you, but then Gary provides this physics point of view, and then they provide all the other humanity stuff that goes on in there. So
so I read you as the daughter. So like when she's addressing you and she says this is when you'll do this and you'll do this, it's the daughter, right?
Oh. Well, so yeah, there's this. Now are we getting into?
Maybe we should get into the plot here so we can really dial in on it. So does anybody have any other non-spoiler thoughts we get to before we give our spoiler warning?
I did have one more thing I wanted to ask you guys that I felt would be kind of fun. just thinking about determinism, I was wondering if you had any strong opinions of it. Do you have any sort of, I don't know, I guess take yourself out of your current life and kind of think of determinism and think like, do you subscribe to that, or do you push back against that? Like, what do you think about that as a concept?
Do you want to tackle that one, Mark?
Jiminy crickets. Let's go back to variational calculus.
Okay.
No, let's not.
I thought you were going to link the two. I was going to be impressed.
Oh, God, yeah, right. $1 million right there. Without getting woo-woo and religious about it, I think there is a certain amount of purpose to what we do. And that I also believe there's a lot of things that are going on that we can't necessarily understand. Like, and the nearest analogy I can give you is I have chickens out in the backyard. And I'll talk to my chickens about math once in a while. And, it's like, no, really, the square root of 4 is 2. And they're all looking at me like, they're just googly eyed. It's like, oh my God, here he is to feed us again. And, it's blah, 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 ginger. So they don't have the processing power and linguistic understanding to understand what it is I'm telling them about math. They don't even know math is a thing.
Right.
And I take that up a couple of steps, and there's probably things that I don't understand, or I don't have the context to understand about what's happening. So Getting back to your question about determinism, I'm not willing to believe that there isn't fate because I don't know.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to stop there.
I get you.
And that I'm going to say something that probably means next to nothing, but this is something we talked about in some philosophy courses I took in college, and it's something I find endlessly fascinating. And I think where I'm at, just personally, where I've landed is the idea that I don't know that free will and determinism are necessarily exclusive from one another. And the way that they might interact is the way that you're discussing. Like it's something that maybe we just don't understand. It seems like on the surface, of course, you can't have something be fated and also have something be truly free. Yet it's more about, like Ted talked about this. It's more about I think in this story it talks. It's like, have you read from the book that has the record of your existence? And if you haven't read from that book, even though it may exist already, you still have at least the perception of free will, even if it's already been determined. And I don't know, like it's the question is that enough to say that free will actually exists or not? I don't know. This is a question for the philosophers. I'm not one. But
I think what you just said there is a beautiful summation of one of the themes of this story. Right.
No, it is. Yeah, because that's something that Louise deals with. As she starts to learn about her future and that's something that I think Ted wants to talk about, and that was in his presentation, and that's here. And you can look at it as a refutation of the possibility of time travel, that because you can't possibly know your future, because then you would change it, which makes it not like which invalidates things and creates paradoxes, right? And because of that, people can say, well, time travel must not be possible for that reason alone. But then I also thought in his presentation he gave one of the best arguments for it actually being possible, and here's how it could happen if it could happen, which was fascinating that he sort of set it up and then knocked it down. And I don't know that there's a good answer for that. It's something that we're going to be asking for a long time, I think, and whether that's a scientist question or a philosopher question or both, I don't know.
Yeah, I like how you guys answered that. A lot of what this story was making me think about was how we see events in our life as cause and effect, right? So we do something and that leads to us then doing this next thing and that next thing, and just this idea, this concept of if there is a way that we can see our life from the top down and look at it all on some plane and understand that this doesn't necessarily lead to this, but in some way it was always going to happen, but I don't know, it kind of touches on what is the meaning of life at that point, right? It's like if everything's predetermined, then why not just lay back and let whatever happens. And I don't know. I just found it endlessly fascinating to kind of mull over in my head.
You know, and to bring in another super heady sci-fi concept, it also feels kind of pointless to me to worry about it. And that's like the same thing with the idea, it's the like simulation argument, that the entire universe and us and our consciousness is all part of a simulation run by some computer, I guess. And the point being to me that like, if the simulation is so good that is indistinguishable from reality, then there's no point in arguing about it.
As people in the simulation, it's beyond us to worry about it. So we should just live our lives peacefully in the simulation. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And
this gets back to having the frame of reference and the vocabulary to even be able to discuss it.
Right.
We may look outside of our computer-generated reality at what is actually reality and have no clue what we're looking at because we don't have the structures and the structures and vocabulary that we need in order to describe what it is we're seeing.
Yeah. So ultimately, what's the point in doing it? I mean, it's fun, I guess, but you're not gonna like figure it out. And that's the way I feel about free will / determinism stuff. Like, of course, it feels like you have free will, and it would, even if determinism is 100% true and you have a fated future. It doesn't matter to you because anything you do in response to that idea is something you would have done anyway. You can't escape it. So there's a sort of like a claustrophobic feeling you can get when you think about that. And I love that this story engages with that in what I thought was sort of a new take. And instead of being sort of afraid of it or trapped by it, Louise deals with it in a way where she embraces it. Which we got to get into spoilers here because we're starting to bump up against them. So I'm going to go ahead and give the spoiler tags. Sorry if any of that was a little bit spoilery, but we're going to get into now more specific stuff. I actually have a plot synopsis I'm going to read a little bit of just to sort of set the table for us, and then we can dive into it more. Okay. So the story of your life is narrated by linguist Dr. Louise Banks the day her daughter is conceived. Addressed to her daughter, the story alternates between recounting the past, the coming of the aliens, and deciphering of their language, and remembering the future, what will happen to her unborn daughter as she grows up, and the daughter's untimely death. All right, so let's just stop there. So that's sort of the premise of the story. And what a premise it is to deal with that and to structure the story this way. I am endlessly fascinated by story premises and then the execution that follows. But this is a big one to me.
That paragraph is like it's a stunning paragraph, and then we all stand back and look at Ted and go, "Okay, buddy."
Yeah.
Yeah. Now let's see how you do.
Exactly. You've set up this almost impossible sounding premise. How do you execute it now? And that's the challenge as a writer, and your ability to execute it's gonna determine how successful you are. And I think it's safe to say he does a great job, knocks it out of the park. So.
Oh yeah, and by the way, my copy is 39 pages long.
Okay,
it's just quick.
It does go fast.
It's a brief read. Yeah, it's a very efficient story. So
I'd be curious to know what the actual word count is on it because I've seen it described online as a novella, but it feels to me more like maybe a novelette length. But I don't know how interesting that is to our listeners.
Well, you can have a whole other session on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think about this setup, James?
So I don't know how much we want to talk about the heptapods this early on, but the story structure as I went on, I realized was Ted using the structure of the story in order to allow the reader to more easily interpret how the heptapods experience the life in general, how they experience time. And I loved that, like, as I was going on, the concept was not it was not hard for me to grasp in any way that the heptapods would perceive time in this way, because that's exactly what our main character has been doing the entire time. The way that she bounces from her future child, back to herself with the heptapods and learning the language. And I think that one decision in structure is brilliant on its own, and it just makes for such an interesting and unique story, I think.
Something that really draws me to the story is that these aliens really are alien.
Yeah.
They're not little
Martians.
Green men. Yeah, with 2 legs and 2 arms, and they speak a version of English.
Right.
They're like, not only their
Truly
physical
alien.
being is different, but their process of thinking about things is not, just you can't pick it up when you first get in there. I mean, I love that about this story.
Absolutely. We'll get into the heptapods more now, but James, what you just said, I wanted to mention the structure of the story. I like that as he's analyzing the linguistics and the limitations of the sort of sequential speech of human language. He sort of protects himself from criticisms of that too, because it's like this story is being written down as we're reading it in human language. Therefore, there's a certain sequential nature to it by definition as you read it from start to finish. And it almost feels like if you could somehow step back and truly experience the story all as one moment, one thing, joined together, that you'd have that like heptapod view of the universe and all through Ted's story here. So it could be potentially mind blowing.
Right. So cool.
Which is cool. It like works on this meta level, right? All right, so let's get into the little bit of the plot here, what actually goes down. So the aliens arrive in spaceships and entered Earth's orbit. 112 devices resembling large semicircular mirrors appeared at sites across the globe. Dubbed looking glasses, they are audiovisual links to the aliens in orbit, who are called heptapods for their seven-limbed appearance. Luis and physicist Dr. Gary Donnelly are recruited by the U.S. Army to communicate with the aliens and were assigned to one of the 9 looking glass sites in the U.S. They made contact with 2 heptapods they nicknamed Flapper and Raspberry. In an attempt to learn their language, Luis began by associating objects and gestures with sounds the aliens made, which revealed a language with free word order and many levels of center-embedded clauses. She found their writing to be chains of semigrams on a 2-dimensional surface in no linear sequence, and semasiographic, probably saying that wrong, having no reference to speech. Louise concluded that because her speech and their writing are unrelated, the heptapods have 2 languages, which she called heptapod A, speech, and heptapod B, writing. So this is the initial discovery that the spoken language of the heptapods and the written language are, in fact, 2 different languages. And the way that this discovery comes about within the story is definitely very hard sci-fi. It's very linguistic focused, but very fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I found that really interesting that, and Ted solves a problem too. It's like, okay, so how could this civilization evolve without, I mean, you assume that all civilizations evolve from some waveform transmission. That's their initial communication. We use sound. Or we use light or something. And so, but that's by nature a sequential form of communication. You can't have one sound appear before another, or you can't have all sounds appear at the same time without having cacophony. Right. So it's interesting how Ted has incorporated, okay, so they've got a sound language. Yeah, okay, it's there. But then they came up with this word language that is better suited to their understanding of how things work. I just thought that was a beautiful piece of dodging the inevitable.
So I have a question for you guys, and I don't know. And I wanted to start by saying I love that this book had me Googling. I was Googling constantly trying to really keep up with because that's the thing is like if I see a word that I completely don't understand and I can't put in context, like I have to find out what it means to understand what's going on going forward. So I love that I'm just Googling all of these concepts, and yes, some of them are hard to wrap your head around even if you Google them, but but it's still an engaging and fun read. But I wanted to ask you guys because I believe there are certain languages here on Earth even that you'll have symbols that represent entire sentences or there's entire meanings built into certain symbols, right?
Right.
I think the argument is given of like do not cross kind of thing, like or no with the circle and the slash through it. What do you make of that like almost universal sort of languages and how like it kind of relates back to this? Is that kind of the same concept, or do you think that theirs is so much more complex that like it's just well beyond anything? Like, because I was thinking at first I was thinking a lot about like hieroglyphics, or like I know there's some Asian cultures that some of their characters are like represent sentences or something like that.
Luke?
So to me, this sounds like a question for a linguist. So anything I say, I guess I'd be giving the old manser, as Mark said. But yeah, I mean, just to sort of think about what you're saying, I agree. It does seem like there is kind of a little bit of this that goes on in our society, and I think that's a good thing because it gives like a launch pad for understanding the concept that Ted is trying to put forward here. Like, we do have an example of this in the, like, you know, no smoking symbol that's like, you know, or just do not do this thing, circle with a slash through it. As an example of I think it's called like a non-glottal type of language, and that the symbol itself doesn't try to evoke sound. It is sort of it's not interested in doing that. Mm-hmm. And the argument is that is what their language is doing as well, is it's not trying to evoke any sort of sound. This is purely a visual medium. And it's almost just like a basis, like a starting off point to what makes their language different than ours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. That's, you know, the red circle with a slash through it is something that he brings up somewhere along the line, and they talk about using. I mean, that does not have a sound associated with it. It has a meaning associated with it.
Right.
The difference that I think that he's trying to make with that particular example is that it is still a sequential collection of thoughts.
Right.
That one thought happens before another thought, and what he's trying to get at in the story is that the way that their writing works is it's you know, and they talk about writing the actual characters and how the complete sentence is there even with the first stroke. And that in order to write that language, you have to know what the language or what the sentence is going to finally say. Versus writing, you know, the slow fox caught the rabbit, which is all very sequential and one after another.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of, I mean, it's not really related, but we were talking about Neil Gaiman in one of our other projects, how he handwrites a lot of his first drafts. And one of the things he found that he liked about it was that he would stop and think an entire sentence through before committing it to paper. And so that the sentences are sort of coming out fully formed. Obviously, you still have to write them sequentially, but the idea that you know where you're going before you set pen to paper is you know, I thought kind of a novel one and something that was interesting. And I thought about a little bit in this story.
Yeah.
Something else that comes up for me when I think about the way that the heptapods write, like you're saying, it's all everything at once. The only thing that I could really relate it to in my own mind was like a work of art, was like a painting. Is like there may be meaning within a painting, and everything's there immediately. It's whether like you pick up on the little pieces that are different than maybe something you'd see in another painting. So it's almost like looking at a piece of art and drawing meaning from it without it having a sound associated with it, like you were saying.
Yeah.
So that's really an excellent way to look at it. I mean, I think so. Now, you know, Ted might have different opinions, but I dig. Yeah.
Yeah, and so for me, when I was trying to wrap my head around it, and especially when it started talking about like everything is there from the first stroke, it reminded me of watching something being printed. Like you know, if you write up something, you see it come out of the printer. The first stroke includes all of the words, like a piece of all of the words comes out together essentially, or it feels like it does at least, and. So that was kind of how I imagined it. It's like you have this symbol in mind, and then you're almost printing it out, like just building it all at the same time, with it all in mind. And so that was kind of how I was able to picture their ability to create these symbols.
I like that. That's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, let me read a little more plot here. So, attempts were also made to establish heptapod terminology in physics. Little progress was made until a presentation of Fermat's principle of least time was given. Gary explained the principle to Louise, giving the example of the reflection of light, and that light will always take the fastest possible route. Louise reasoned, a ray of light has to know where it will ultimately end up before it can choose the direction to begin moving in. She knew the heptapods did not write a sentence one semigram at a time, but drew all the ideograms simultaneously, suggesting that they knew the entire sequence what the entire sequence would be beforehand. Luis realized that instead of experiencing events sequentially, causality, heptapods experience all events at once, teleology. So there you go. There's some vocab terms for you. So they're able to link this physics principle regarding the refraction of light to an understanding of how heptapods can use their language and experience events. What did you think of this use of science to bring apart this concept that is at the heart of the story?
I'm not, it's like having read it and I look back on it and go like, how else would you explain it? Unfortunately, that's it. It's, and they talk about that a bunch. They talk about, they're trying to communicate algebra, and basic math, they're able to discuss via the looking glass. But then they start to get into algebra and geometry, and it just falls flat. They don't get it.
You're talking about the scientists are trying to explain it to the heptapods?
I'm sorry.
Right.
Yes, right. They're trying to explain to the heptapods, what vocabulary do you use for algebra? Mm-hmm. And the heptapods are going like, algebra? Was ist das? We don't know. You know? Yeah. And it's not until they get into this advanced calculus with Fermat's theory that they now have a basis for discussing things. It gives you, again, it sets you into this situation where the thinking of the aliens is truly alien.
Yeah.
And you have to use that kind of language in order to understand how it is that they think.
Yeah.
Right.
And speaking about this, makes me think about how I interpret things as well. The way that, just speaking of like a formula like this, reading it on the page, I don't know about you guys, but it made sense the first time around, but I had to read it multiple times. And even then, that's when I turned to Google. This is a great example of when I turned to Google, and I needed like a visual representation of like what, and because I think it's because I'm such a visual learner. I'm such a visual, like I see things. And that's really when I started to understand it to, I think, the extent that he was trying to compare it to the heptapods and the way that they were processing, I guess. But yeah, it's just interesting thinking like, I couldn't, like, they can't interpret what we're saying with algebra or whatever because it's like they like are so beyond it or something like that. And then when I read this on the page for myself, I'm like, I can't interpret this in the same way that they can't interpret things. But then if I see it in a different way, it becomes clear, kind of thing. So
I think this is an example of how the science in this story is used so masterfully to establish the themes, to establish the structure of the story and the plot of the story. And that's like brilliant hard sci-fi whenever I see it, is where like you're talking about the truly alien and these heady concepts, but they're not just thrown in as like, what if this was a thing? What if, it's more like extrapolating out from a principle that is widely accepted. Well, let's extrapolate out from that. And what if, building upon these things that we can all agree are true, what if then this? So it's like a different way of asking what if, and it's because it's the starting off point that I think is so important.
Yeah. Following up on something you said too, Stan Schmidt, who is the editor for Analog, somebody asked him one time, well, what makes a good science fiction story? And what separates a science fiction story from not science fiction? And he would look at it and he said, well, okay, so in a science fiction story, the story can't exist without the science.
Right.
You can't just take a romance and throw in laser guns and have a science fiction story. There has to be some reason why those laser guns are there other than they happen to be in the story. And that's, what he's done with this math. And to build on that, they go on later, and I'm looking at this little thing that I highlighted. By contrast, the linguists were having much more success. And it's really interesting. Here the physicists are beating their heads against the wall, and the linguists are going like, well, this is great.
Yeah.
This is easy. I'm starting to understand that. Now, what's telling is that particular paragraph ends with, whether scientists or tourists, they were an awfully incurious bunch in reference to the heptapods. They, throughout the story, and Luke, you'll get into this, I bet, but throughout the story, they're not asking a lot of questions from the humans.
Right. Yeah, and they behave in a much more mysterious manner than they even do in the film, where I feel like they do attempt to attribute some sort of motivations to the aliens. Whereas here, it's not clear, and I think that adds to that mystery, like you're talking about with the truly alien nature of, and that's something we dealt with a little bit in like Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, where it's like, what if there's an intelligence that doesn't want things in the way that we understand it? And that seems to be true for these aliens too, and that their motivations may be just something we can't even understand. And I think that's displayed by a scene where there's like a bureaucrat, I believe he was, or maybe a general or something, with all these theories about like, well, they must want this, and they're gonna ask us for something, right? And like he's coming up with all these things, and they may say this, but what they actually mean, and of course, Luis and Gary are both tuning him out because he's completely talking out of his ass. He has no idea, and he doesn't even realize how much he has no idea.
Yeah, well, he's trying to overlay his understanding of the situation,
right?
And the heptapods are like, whatever, dude,
Yeah.
And then the final gift exchange, which is like, we already knew this. Wait a minute.
That's funny.
Come back here.
Yeah. We have to talk about that when we get there. Let's progress through the plot a little bit more here.
Okay.
So soon, Luis becomes quite proficient at heptapod B, that's the writing, and found that when writing it, trains of thought were directionless, and premises and conclusions were interchangeable. She found herself starting to think in heptapod B and began to see time as heptapods do. Louise saw glimpses of her future and of a daughter she did not yet have. This raised questions about the nature of free will. Knowledge of the future would imply no free will, because knowing the future means it cannot be changed. But Louise asked herself, what if the experience of knowing the future changed a person? What if it evoked a sense of urgency, a sense of obligation to act precisely as she knew she would? So let's talk about that, because I think that is sort of, we touched on it earlier. That is the to me the refreshing sort of alternate view of determinism that this story takes, and that's that there is she seems to find satisfaction in performing. I think is a phrase even used in the story, performing her present. And she knows what she's going to say, yet she is almost compelled to say it, and there seems to be a certain pride she takes in performing it to perfectly, which I want to know how do you feel about that? Does it seem plausible, I guess, as a premise that someone would feel this way when engaging their own future?
Whoa, here's a philosophy question. I didn't know we were on philosophy talk.
The story demands it, so we go wherever the story takes us.
Right. This kind of, for me, got back to the whole thing of looking at our fate as presented in literature and fiction. And, every story that you come... Well, okay, so excuse me for bringing up Star Wars.
No, absolutely. Go for it.
It's all about fate, right? Luke's fate. Where are you going to be? Or Darth Vader's fate. It's all an arc of his fate. And, can you stop your fate? Can you interrupt what's destined for you? And we never really ask the question until this story, would you want to interrupt your fate?
Right.
We always assume that, you want to, Oedipus, again, you want to interrupt your fate. You don't want this to happen. Or you always want to screw with, the future because, we like to screw with things.
Right, we want to make it better.
Right, yeah,
Well, I think that poses an interesting question again, because for myself, in the scenario presented for the main character, I feel like every muscle fiber, every part of me would be fighting against going along with what she has ahead of her, even if she's seen it and she sees how it plays out. What is it? Is it like a noble pursuit, or is it just acceptance, or what do you think it is there that pushes her along? Because I personally, with that knowledge, I don't know that I could. I think I would be that person to push against fate and try to change my future.
So I'm gonna try and explain what's going on in my head right now, and I think it's touching on it, but I'm gonna struggle because I have to speak sequentially. But so I'm thinking of Time is a Flat Circle as related to True Detective. Do you remember that the idea that like this suffering is eternal and all this stuff, right? And it was a very dark look at a similar sort of concept to what we're getting here. And to me, she has this heptapod view, and I like that it is a more positive and sort of uplifting look at a similar subject matter. And she's looking at her life as a whole. And even though she is forced to perform it sequentially because of like the nature of existence, she can see all of it. So even as she enters into moments of tragedy with her daughter, and she knows where it's going, she equally sees everything that came before, and she sees all the good times, and she has all these moments that stick out to her that I think makes it all worth it. And it feels like this is just what it is. As much as I can't change what has come before, I can't change what is to come. It is all part of the same moment to her because she can see it all at once. And so she has an acceptance there. I think that is actually pretty beautiful. And I think a lot when people talk about tragedy of like, you know, about what is lost when someone dies, and you focus more on like what existed when they lived, I think that's a beautiful way to look at it and say that those moments of life are sort of eternal and always there.
Right.
Even though that person is now gone in our sequential experience. Did I do any justice trying to put that out there?
That's great.
I think you kind of prompted something in me. The idea of losing someone, right? The idea of their life is a linear timeline. And so the idea of losing someone and having them born at the same time, the joy and the suffering. And if you could place yourself, like if you could be outside of time and you could place yourself at any time, you understand that. I think that does, like you're saying, it does make it easier to cope with someone's death because you are dealing with that potentially as they are born. So it's like sort of if you don't want to, you don't have to linger in the death. You could be in the middle.
Right,
you could be in the happy times and like specifically key in on those things rather than, you know, only being, because it's like in a linear storyline, when the death happens, you're trapped in that time. You're trapped in that death for whatever period of time you grieve for.
Yeah, you're touching on the essential conflict of this story because as she even says, like our human minds are unable to fully understand the way heptapods view the universe. And so it's within her that the conflict is like, I have to experience this sequentially, yet I can see it as a whole. Mm-hmm. And that is the essential conflict I think that he's dealing with in this story.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it'd be interesting to hear what a Zen master would have to say about this.
Yeah, right.
You know, and one of the things that comes to mind is that we assume that if we knew our fate, we could view it as a series of discrete events that you could go through and pick and choose which discrete events you want, and then you get the best of all possible worlds. But you know, as we know from Groundhog Day or, you know, any other time travel movie, if you start, you can't grab a chunk of an event or an experience and have the event turn out the same. You know, I mean, if I want the experience of having a friend, that also means that experience will include that friend's death at some point. So do I never form friends? No, I form friends because of the entire rich experience.
Yeah, and if you extrapolate that out to the way she feels about her daughter, you know, she still chooses to conceive the daughter. You could argue whether or not she actually had a choice, I think is irrelevant. She goes ahead with conceiving the daughter, even as she is talking to the daughter and expressing that your entire life is contained within my perception of time, and I can see all of it from the moment of conception to the moment of your death, and I can see all the happy, I can see all the sad, and I am still choosing to go through with it because it already is. I think like it's almost not a choice, but it's more just I can see it now, but there is a sense of satisfaction or acceptance that I think is important. Because once again, this is not a negative story. This isn't a story about being claustrophobic and trapped. It's more a story about like joyful acceptance of that future.
When we think of it in our own narrative human minds, and we don't think of it as a heptapod, you can see the beats, the plot points that are leading to eventually what happens with her daughter. You can see her daughter with, what was it? She was like with a guy in a car, something with some drinking, and somebody was drinking or something like that.
So I think I wasn't completely clear, but it seemed to me like maybe she was rock climbing and fell is how she died.
No, I think that's pretty clear. That's what happens.
Okay. Are you talking about like how she died, James, or just something that happened?
I thought that there was, besides the time that she actually died, I thought there was another time that she was like telling her daughter to be careful kind of thing. Like she was out late with boys or something like that.
Yes.
And then she was worried because she knew how her daughter would die.
I mean, the character of Louise really strikes me as being somebody who's thrown into this situation and then learns something and then shows an amazing strength of character. And how that embodies it in the story is she learns the future of her daughter, which is going to be death as a rock climbing accident. Mm-hmm. And all throughout the story, she is watching her daughter learn to be a rock climber, learn to take these chances. And, in some cases, actually, it's like climbing. And, how could you look at your child and see them learning to climb and knowing this is how you're going to die and not say, get down from that rock.
Right. And that's the challenge that you're presented with here. Yeah, I love that. It's like she doesn't have this easy life that she can just step back and look at and then perform. She has a tragedy that is put on display throughout this entire story to drive it home. And that does remind me of some brilliant writing in there where it seemed to me, and now I'm not a parent, and I know James isn't, but Ted was talking about how she looks at her daughter, and for like one of the first times she realizes that this is a completely different person than me, that this is not a copy of me, this is not a clone, that they are doing things that I would never do. And there's sort of it's like a sobering moment for Louise as a parent. And there's a lot of these like parental moments throughout that really drives home the tragedy and beauty of the parent-daughter relationship, the mother-daughter relationship that goes on here that is so effective. And that's that emotional truth I was talking about earlier that I think sometimes can get lost as we delve so much into the science, is that there is a real emotional truth and core to this story.
Yeah. And that one passage, I've got that highlighted. It's a masterful piece of writing.
Do you want to go ahead and read a little bit of it? Would be
I got
great.
it right here. Yeah. So this is that paragraph that you're talking about. What I'll think is that you are clearly, maddeningly not me. It will remind me again that you won't be a clone of me. You can be wonderful, a daily delight, but you won't be someone I could have created by myself. And it's like, wow, Ted, nice job,
right.
Man. It's like, whew, yeah.
And did that passage resonate with you?
Oh, I am a parent, and I look at my kids and I go like, where did you come from? Where did you learn that? Mm-hmm. And you sure didn't learn it from me. And you would love to have control over everything in your life, and then you have kids, and suddenly you realize, nope, I get to influence things to a certain extent, but this whole parenting thing is just the power of suggestion at best.
I like that. So that's good. I mean, it felt like just a true moment to me, and I'm glad to hear that it rang that way to you too.
No, I have a question just as a biography for Ted. Is Ted a parent?
I did not see that. Do you know, Mark?
I don't know offhand. I know Ted is very private.
Yeah, that's probably why. That's probably why I didn't see that. Maybe this isn't. He tends to keep to himself, and maybe that's not widely known. I do know he has a partner, but beyond that, I didn't see if they had kids. Whether he's a parent or not, he really did find, I think, a lot of truth in this, and I think there is a point where he talked about. One of the inspirations for this story being a friend of his who had a child. And so maybe it could be conversations with them or his own experience. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, either way, it feels like he nailed it.
Right. I think he has understanding regardless.
Well, if you can nail the physics, nailing the whole parenthood thing is right up there. He did that too. So,
all right. So I'm going to give the final paragraph of plot, and then we can kind of put a bow on this. So one day after the information exchange with the heptapods, the aliens announced they were leaving. They shut down the looking glasses and their ships disappeared. It was never established why they left or why they had come in the first place. The heptapod languages changed Louise's life, and once she knew the future, she never acted contrary to that future. Gary and Louise start spending time together and eventually marry. When Gary asks Louise if she wants a baby, she agrees, knowing that they will divorce and that their daughter will die young. So that comes around, that really drives the point home when at the end she accepts this. Because I think it's hard for me to imagine reading this a little bit as a first time, never having seen the movie Arrival. But I imagine a reader is probably reading about the tragedy of the daughter, thinking about, okay, this story's probably got some time travel elements, and holding out hope that it's going to be revealed that Louise is able to change this horrible fate. She's able to change that it's going to happen, right? Like I have a feeling people are going to be rooting for that as they read it. And then you get to the end and it's the opposite of that. It's acceptance.
So this part of the story is the part that drives me absolutely berserk.
Okay.
That Ted, I mean, basically what he does is he pulls the plug on the aliens, just flips them off like a light switch. They're gone. No explanation why. Hasta la vista, baby.
Yeah.
I have written stories like that, and they've been rejected and sent back and said, no, you really have to finish this. We need resolution here.
Right.
And which they do in the movies. What really hit me was that the way that Ted does this, where he ends the story and Louise accepts what she's doing, like you say, accepts it rather than tries to change it. Mm-hmm. It turns the story not into a story about the aliens and not about the language, but about how Louise decides to deal with this new revelation in her life.
And that's why I think he's able to get away with not explaining the aliens here. When you take it and you turn it into a 2-hour movie, maybe there's different expectations there. But I think you're right, because it seems almost like this frustratingly like, how can you not explain why they're there? But when it ties back into everything we were talking about with this sort of like they're playing like 5-dimensional chess and we just have no concept of what they're doing. That for them to inexplicably leave sort of plays into that. And it's like, well, maybe they have a reason, but we just don't see it. And I love that you can kind of read into the subtext, which I think Denis Villeneuve does in the movie, and to try and see that the gift of this language, the gift of this perception is sort of their goal. But I will admit, I went into the story having seen the movie, so would I have come to that conclusion on my own? I don't know. But I imagine there might have been people who read it and said, oh, this is why the aliens came. Right.
Well, see, and that's an interesting point. Is that if you watch the movie before you read the story, you'll walk into it with just exactly what you just said. If you read the story and then walk into the movie, you kind of you're going to come to some different conclusions.
Right.
About
is that how you experienced the story? By the way, did you read it first?
I read the story first.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and then walked into the movie, and I was like, oh, okay, that is a very movie thing to do.
Okay, so we're going to have to revisit that next week when we talk about the movie. But James, I wanted to get your thoughts here at the end on do you think I'm onto something, or do you think that people are reading this story hoping for the child to be saved?
I mean, I think definitely. I think in a more typical sci-fi narrative that plays out, right? Like we figure out why the aliens are here, what like she's able to change her future based on this alien language. She's able to see it and now change it based on that, and that's like a power that she's been given by these aliens. But I like what you said about, because I felt kind of the same way about this idea that like we didn't understand so much about them, and we don't understand why they're there in the first place. So why would we understand why they would leave? You know, Like it of course it makes sense that they would leave without us understanding why, because we didn't know why they were there in the first place. So they may have accomplished some goal, and like whether it was altruistic or whether it was something, like the general was like, we're gonna make deals on resources or whatever and all that stuff. Like it's not really about that. It's about how it's about changing your perspective. It's about thinking about something outside of your own existence, I think. And I think that in fitting with that, the aliens leaving and us not understanding fits. I think that ties a nice bow on it.
I will. So there is the common sci-fi trope of like something terrible's happened and then you try and change it. But what you often also see is the inverse of that, like the original Terminator film, being that there is a horrible future. The events of the story are an effort to change it, and then at the end, it's revealed that everything you did was for naught. The future is inevitable. It is still going to happen. Now, I'm not talking about later Terminators where they changed that, but the original one, the original one, the implication is it cannot be changed. Everything that you thought you did was all already going to happen. Right. And so that's the way I think it's like one of those two is what we typically see from time travel stories. And so this, to me, was a refreshing change in that sense of it is neither of those things. It is more of a positive look at the idea of the inescapable fate. Which sounds like that's not even possible, but I really felt that way reading this. Like it was a celebration of the idea of fate in a way.
That's great. That's very poetic. The fate is not something you necessarily want to escape.
Right.
Ted brought this up in his talk too. He talked about Back to the Future. Mm-hmm. And he talked about Looper and how, both of those movies are, you see fate and fate is something to overcome. And, the successful hero at the end changes his life to be better because fate was wrong. Right. In his story, he's like going like, no, fate was right. Right. And fate's something to embrace.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It is as much a part of you as your past or as even your present. It just is. And I think finding acceptance of it is the laudable thing that Louise does here. That's why we can look at Louise as I think a powerful character, and because I think there is a certain self-driven journey of coming to accept, learning to accept what the tragedy of what comes to be, and just touching a little bit. I think that's something that is explored in the film really, really well, and I'm really excited to go watch this movie now. I have not watched it yet, other than my original. I think I saw it in the theater originally. I haven't seen it since. I am so excited to rewatch this movie, especially now that I've read the story. I think it's going to add a lot to a lot of these scientific scenes. I think I imagine there may be some things I'll be frustrated with changes-wise, but just in general, I love Denis Villeneuve as a director. I thought this movie was brilliant when I saw it, and I'm very excited to get back into it.
Yeah, me too.
Definitely. I did have one more quick point about the book that I wanted to make, which was this idea of something outside of our understanding, and it was that these looking glass mirror things, right? In the story, it said that at first people think that it's some sort of new compound or some sort of new thing that could be used and utilized by the human race, but it turns out to just be like silicone or some sort of like right, am I right in saying that's some sort of silica-based thing? Yeah. And ultimately, nothing we hadn't seen before. They were just using it in ways that we couldn't understand.
Yeah. It's a windshield.
Right.
Right. And I mean that's the take on technology that they keep getting. It's like, all these wonderful things that the heptapods give them are like, we already knew that, or we just there's stuff that is not, it's outside. It's, again, getting back to my chickens, they don't get it because they don't have the vocabulary to understand what happened.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so these heptapods are understanding life on another level that we can't even comprehend. But this story gives us a little springboard. It gives us a little taste of what that might be. Maybe Ted understands the world and the universe in a way that we can only imagine.
Ted is a secret heptapod.
Yeah, that's a secret heptapod.
Yeah, we didn't count his legs. So.
All right. I think that's a great spot to leave this discussion for now. We will resume it next week with Mark when he returns. Mark, you have mentioned to me in the past that you are also an educator. I thought you might talk a little bit about that for LinkedIn Learning and what you teach on there.
Well, if you haven't gotten enough of me here, you can catch me up on LinkedIn Learning, which used to be called lynda.com. And I teach 2 topics, one of them which is Raspberry Pi, and one of them which
I love
is
Raspberry
the
Pi, very tasty.
Yeah, you and my wife, unfortunately. She's very disappointed that the Raspberry Pi is a credit card-sized microcomputer.
Oh, okay, I see.
She would much prefer if it was a cooking show, but
Right.
since
I mean, in my opinion, equally tasty, but to each his own.
very fun stuff. And then I teach the R programming language when I'm not writing science fiction.
Okay, well, that's awesome. So definitely, is there a way people can find you online if they want to follow you?
Oh, yes. Actually, probably the best way to do it is if you look for Niemann-Ross. There's only 3 of us right now. It's a hyphenated last name, and you'll eventually bump across niemannross.com. And you can find out more about what it is that I do, and you can even write, and yes, I will write back.
Are you on Twitter?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Reddit, I'm on... what else is out there? Oh, I'm on Skype right now. But if you really want me to respond, send me an email, and you can find out how to do that at my website, niemannross.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us, and we really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to talking with you again next week. Listeners, if you would like to enter to win that copy of Stories of Your Life and Others, make sure to send that email. Once again, the subject line Heptapods, and we will enter you in to win it. It's a cool collection filled with awesome stories. I'm sure I haven't read them all, but just this little bit of Ted Chiang that I've read, I'm eager to dive into more of it. So make sure to do that.
All right, I can't think of a movie that I've been more excited to jump back into. I'm excited to watch Arrival. Denis Villeneuve is one of my favorite working directors. I cannot wait to dive into it. We do want to thank our patrons, Cora S and Amanda VP, for being patrons and for using your tokens towards this project, because we would not be covering it as early as we are without those tokens. So we really appreciate you putting those towards this project. And I hope you're enjoying the coverage so far.
Yeah, and if you wanted to become a patron yourself, make sure to go to patreon.com/ink2film. And if you'd like to follow us online, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We are at ink2film on all 3. And make sure to join our Council of Inklings on Facebook.
You can leave a rating and review on iTunes or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Those ratings really help to spread the word about the podcast and get more listens. So we really appreciate those. We read them all, and we post them on social media all the time. So definitely send those in if you can.
And we just wanted to thank Ross Bugden for use of our intro and outro music, and Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much for joining us this week. We're going to be covering the film next week, and we can't wait for you to join us there again.
I'm looking forward to it, you guys. This has really been fun.
Thanks for being here. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.